I kept the human ledger for 41 years, and in all that time the Vale Concord of settled matters never once asked to see it. They had their own record. Theirs was the only one that counted by their reckoning because theirs was the record that could end things. A matter entered into the Concord's register and sealed there was finished, not argued, not deferred, not pending appeal. Finished. The Vale did not rule on questions. They closed them. That was the whole of their dignity, and they wore it the way an old soldier wears a scar he is proud of, the way men wear the one thing they are certain no one can take from them. I was the recording secretary to a delegation that, by the Concord's own law, did not exist. So I sat where I had always sat, at the low table beneath the speaking floor, in the cold shadow of the tiers, with my stylus and my plain bound book, and I wrote down what the masters of finality did on the day they came to close us forever. Let me set the room first, because the room mattered. The room was the argument. The Concord met inside the sealing hall, and I have never since stood in a space built so completely to make a small thing feel its smallness. Imagine a chamber wide enough to lose a town in. The floor was a single disk of pale gray stone, veined dark, polished until it gave back the light like still water, and at its center stood the speaking floor, a raised round dais where a petitioner was meant to stand and be judged. Around that dais, the seating rose in rings, tier upon tier, climbing into the dimness overhead, and every tier was filled with the Vale. There were thousands of them. I had counted, once in my first decade, the way a young man counts the stars he is afraid of. I had reached a number I no longer trust and stopped. Above all of it arched the dome. The sealing hall's dome was the one warm thing in that cold place, and even the warmth had teeth. It was glass, a vast curved skin of clear panels held in a web of dark metal, and through it the daylight of their capital world poured down in a wide, soft column onto the speaking floor, so that any creature made to stand there stood alone in a pool of brightness, while the judges sat above in cool blue shadow. They had built the light to isolate. They had built it so the one being judged would feel watched from every angle, lit like a specimen, while the thousands who watched stayed comfortably dim. I had seen petitioners weep in that column of light. I had seen them beg. The Vale did not lean forward to hear it. They sat back, and they let the dome do the work. The Vale themselves I will describe plainly, because they deserve plain description and nothing more. They were tall and they were gray, a deep slate gray, smooth across the brow, going pebbled and ridged along the jaw and down the throat, the texture of a riverbed gone dry. Their heads were long, tapering back from the face into a swept ridge of bone, and their eyes were large and lightless and set wide, the pale flat amber of a lamp behind horn. They wore the robes of their station, layered and weighted, gray on gray, each layer edged with a thread that marked how many matters that member had sealed in his service. The oldest among them wore so many edges that their robes hung like armor. When they were satisfied, they were utterly still. When they were displeased, a slow ripple moved through the loose skin of the throat, the way wind crosses standing grain, and 1,000 throats rippling at once was a thing that made the air feel close. At the high seat, above and behind the speaking floor, sat the first of the Concord. His name in their tongue was a thing I could approximate but never properly say, so in my ledger I had always written him simply as the first. He was old past my reckoning. The edges on his robe had stopped being countable and become a texture. He did not gesture when he spoke. He did not need to. The hall had learned to go silent the instant his throat moved. That was the room, that was the body, now the day. The Concord had reconvened, in full ceremony, every tier seated, every edge worn, to do a thing it had done only a handful of times in its long history. It had come to make a seal permanent. I should explain what that meant, because everything that followed turns on it. When the Vale sealed a matter, the seal could, in principle, be lifted. It almost never was. To reopen a sealed matter was to suggest the Concord had erred, and the Concord did not err, but the law allowed it. The lifting of a seal required a petition, a standing, a seat. And 40 years before the day I am describing, The Concord had taken those three things away from us, one after the other, in a single afternoon, and entered the taking into its register as a settled matter. I had been at the low table that afternoon, too, a younger man with a fuller book and a steadier hand. I had watched them do it. The human petition in those days had been a small and a quiet thing. We had come, our species had come, not asking for much. A lane recognized, a claim acknowledged, a seat at the lowest ring where the newest and least of the recognized people sat. We had come the way you come to a court whose authority you have decided, for your own reasons, to accept. Our envoy in those days was a spare gray-haired woman named Idris Vane, and I had served as her secretary, and I had thought, watching her, that she carried herself the way the very best of us carry ourselves before power, without heat, without bowing, with a stillness that the veil could not read, and so distrusted. They had distrusted it. They had looked at our smallness and our quiet and our refusal to plead, and they had decided, the way the certain always decide, that the quiet was emptiness, that we had nothing behind us, that a people who would not raise their voices in that column of light had no voice to raise. So they had closed us. The first of that era, the predecessor of the one who sat above me now, had risen and declared the human petition not denied, which would have left it open to appeal, but concluded, resolved. The human question, he had ruled, was answered. The answer was that there was no question. There would be no seat, because a seat implied a standing, and humanity had demonstrated no standing. The matter was to be entered into the register as settled, the file sealed, the species struck from the active rolls, and the seat that had been provisionally held open for us. A single seat, at the very lowest ring in the dark, was to be dissolved. I remember the dissolution most of all. They did not simply leave the seat empty. That would have been mercy and a kind of honesty. An empty seat says someone is missing. No, a keeper had come down from the tiers with a length of gray cord and a seal of gray wax, and he had bound the arms of that lowest seat together and pressed the Concord's mark into the wax across the joining, so that the seat could not be sat in. A bound seat. A sealed chair. It said more plainly than any ruling, this place is not empty, it is closed. I had watched Idris Vane watch them do it. She had not spoken. The veil had waited. I understood only later that they had wanted her to speak, had wanted the begging, had built the whole long ceremony to draw it out of her, and she had given them nothing. She had risen when it was done, and inclined her head a precise small degree, not in submission but in acknowledgement, the way you acknowledge a thing you have heard and recorded and will not forget. And then she had gathered her people and left the speaking floor, and the dome had poured its bright, indifferent light down onto the bound and sealed seat, and the veil had moved on to the next matter, satisfied. I had written it all down. I had written in my plain book in my plain hand. The seat was bound and sealed. The matter was entered as settled. We were not asked to speak, and we did not. That was 40 years ago. And now the Concord had reconvened to do the one thing that would put even the theoretical possibility of appeal beyond reach, to ratify the seal in perpetuity, to strike the human file not merely from the active rolls, but from the rolls of things that could ever be reactivated, to take the sealed matter and entomb it, to declare, with the full ceremony of the body, that the human question was not only closed but unclosable, now and for all the time the Concord would endure. I want to be careful here about why they bothered. You might think a body that had already struck us, already sealed us, already dissolved our seat, would simply leave us forgotten. That would have been the natural thing. But the veil did not work by the natural thing. They worked by the register, and a register has a logic of its own, and the logic had begun in those 40 years to itch at them. Because we had not gone away. Not loudly. We never did anything loudly. That was the whole of us in the end. But in the 4 decades since they had bound our seat, the human lanes had quietly extended. The human claims, unacknowledged, had quietly been worked anyway. Where the Concord's writ said humanity was concluded, the wider galaxy had begun, here and there, in trade halls and border stations and the back rooms of lesser bodies, to deal with us as though we were a thing that existed. A people the veil had declared finished were turning up, more and more, in places the veil considered theirs, conducting themselves as though no one had ever told them they were closed. It offended the register. A settled matter that refused to behave settled is, to a body whose entire dignity is the finality of its settlements, an intolerable thing. It is a crack in the one wall they cannot allow to crack. So they had reconvened, in full ceremony, every tier, the first in his high seat, to fix the crack, to seal the seal, to put it beyond doubt and beyond appeal and beyond the slow, embarrassing creep of a people who would not stay closed. And I had come, with my plain book, because someone had to keep the human ledger, even of the day the human ledger was to be ended. I did not come alone. I should have. By the Concord's law there was no human delegation, and so there was no reason for human delegation to attend the sealing of its own non-existence. But I had received, 3 days before, a quiet word through the old channels, the channels that should not still have worked, that the Concord believed it had closed along with everything else, that I was to be at my low table in the sealing hall on the appointed day, and that I was not to be alarmed, and that I was to keep my book. That was all. I was to keep my book. I am an old man now, telling this, and I will tell you plainly that I did not understand the word when it came. I thought perhaps that someone meant to make a last small gesture, that some remnant of our people meant to stand in the column of light one final time and let the veil bind the air around them. I thought it might be a funeral. I had brought a clean stylus, the way you bring a pressed collar to a funeral, because the small dignities are what you can control. I took my place at the low table beneath the tiers. The keepers ignored me. I was furniture by then, a fixture of 40 years, the human clerk who kept writing in a book no one read. Above and around me, the Concord assembled itself in its slow, weighted thousands. The dome poured its column of daylight onto the empty speaking floor. And at the very lowest ring, in the dark at the edge of the light, I could see our seat still bound, the gray cord gone brittle and pale with age, the wax seal cracked across its face but unbroken, the Concord's mark still legible in it. 40 years, and they had never cut the cord. A bound seat is a kind of monument. They had wanted it there. The ceremony began the way all their ceremonies began, with the recitation of finality. A reader rose from the middle tiers. They always chose a reader of middle age and middle rank for this, so that the words would sound like the body itself speaking and not any one ambitious member, and he read, in the slow, grinding cadence of their tongue, the list of matters the Concord had settled and sealed since the founding. It was a long list. It took a long time. I had heard pieces of it across the years and never the whole, and as it ground on I understood it was meant to be heard whole only on a day like this one, when the body wished to remind itself, and any who watched, of the sheer weight of things it had closed. Wars ended by a seal. Disputes that had run for centuries, ground to silence by a ruling. Peoples raised, peoples lowered, peoples, I marked this in my book with a cold hand, peoples concluded. We were not the first species the veil had struck from the rolls. We were merely the most recent, and the only one, the reader's cadence implied, foolish enough to keep moving afterward. When the list reached the present, the reader's voice changed, sharpened, formalized, and he came to the matter of the day. He read the human file. He read it the way you read a sentence over a thing already dead. He read the original petition, 40 years gone, the small claim, the requested lane, the seat at the lowest ring. He read the Concord's finding that humanity had demonstrated no standing, that the quiet of our envoy had been read as emptiness, that the petition was concluded for want of any substance behind it. He read the dissolution of the seat, the binding of the chair, the pressing of the seal. And then he read the new motion, that the Concord, having observed that the settled human matter continued to generate disturbance in the register, did now move to ratify its seal in perpetuity, to strike the human file from the rolls of reopenable matters, and to declare the human question closed not only in the present but for the whole future duration of the Concord. He finished. He sat, and the first of the Concord, in his high seat, let the silence stretch the way they liked it to stretch, the long pulling silence in which a petitioner was meant to feel the floor opening under him. And into that silence, the great doors at the far end of the ceiling hall opened. They were not supposed to open. The ceremony of a perpetual sealing admitted no petition, heard no appeal. The doors were meant to stay shut from the first recitation to the final mark. A ripple went through the lower tiers, that slow wind across standing grain, the throats moving as the doors swung wide and the bright outer day came spilling up the long approach. And against that brightness, 3 figures stepped into the hall and began, without hurry, to walk down the long aisle toward the speaking floor. I knew them by their walk before I knew them by anything else. I knew them because they walked the way Idris Vane had walked 40 years before, out of that same hall, without heat, without bowing, with the stillness the veil could not read. There were 3, 2 I did not know, the one in the center I did. She was younger than Vane had been, middle years, dark-haired, going to iron at the temples, built small and square and unhurried. And she wore not the soft diplomatic gray we had worn 40 years ago, but something plainer and harder, a dark-fitted coat with a single band of pale metal at the collar, the kind of clothing that is not trying to be seen and is therefore impossible not to see. She carried nothing. Her hands were empty and easy at her sides. She came down the long aisle through the rippling tears as though the rippling tears were weather, a thing to be walked through, and she did not look up at them. And she did not look afraid, and she did not at any point hurry. The first throat moved, the hall snapped silent. "The doors," he said in their tongue, and the keepers near the entrance flinched. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. "Who has opened the doors?" No one answered because no keeper had opened them. The doors had opened from the outside. That, too, was supposed to be impossible. The woman reached the foot of the speaking floor. The column of daylight fell across the dais in front of her, the bright pool where every petitioner for 1,000 years had stood to be judged and lit and isolated. She looked at it. And then, and I felt the whole hall feel this, felt the thousands register it as a single intake. She did not step into it. She turned instead away from the speaking floor. She walked to the lowest ring, to the dark edge of the light, to the bound and sealed seat with its brittle cord and its cracked old wax. And she stopped in front of it, and she looked at it the way you look at a grave you have come a very long way to visit. And then she reached out one hand and, without ceremony, without a blade, simply pulled the brittle cord apart between her fingers. It came like rotted thread. The cracked wax seal fell from the joining of the chair arms and broke on the stone floor, and the small dry sound of it carried in that enormous silence all the way up to the high seat. She unbound our seat, and she sat down in it. I have, since that day, tried many times to describe what went through the Concord in the moment. A human being sat in the seat they had dissolved, and I have never gotten it right, so I will simply tell you what I saw and let you build it for yourself. I saw a body whose entire being was the finality of its rulings. Watch a finality break. The ripple that went through the tears was not the slow wind across grain. It was something faster and uglier, a shudder that started low and climbed, throat after throat after throat, until the loose skin of 10,000 throats was moving at once, and the air in the hall seemed to thicken with it. They came half out of their seats, here and there, all across the rings, not all at once. Not in a wave, but in scattered points of motion, a member rising in the 3rd tier, 2 more in the 9th, a whole row stirring near the top, like a still pond when the first heavy drops of a storm begin to strike it. The gray, loose-robed mass that had sat in such cold, confident stillness through the recitation of all its settled matters was, for the first time in my 40 years of watching it, not still. And the woman sat in the unbound seat with her empty hands resting easy on the worn arms, and she watched them, and she said nothing at all. The first's throat moved. It took him longer than it had ever taken him. When the words came, they came hard. "That seat," he said, "is dissolved. That matter is sealed. You sit in a thing that does not exist. You are a thing that does not exist." And the hall, hearing him find his footing, began to settle, began, throat by throat, to remember itself, because the first had named the law, and the law was their floor. "Rise," he said, "and stand in the place of petition, and the Concord will record that the closed matter attempted to reopen itself and was closed again." And the woman in the unbound seat looked up the long rise of the tiers to the high seat, and she answered him. She used 6 words. I wrote them in my book exactly as she said them, and I have the book still, and I will give them to you exactly. "We are not here to petition." That was all. She did not explain it. She did not raise her voice to match the size of the hall. She did not stand in the light. She said the 6 flat words from the dark seat at the lowest ring, and then she folded her empty hands and went silent again, and let the 6 words do their work. They did their work slowly. I watched it happen. I watched the first take the 6 words and turn them, the way an old certain mind turns a thing it does not want to understand, looking for the angle that makes it harmless. If they were not here to petition, then they were here to threaten, and a threat could be answered. The Concord had answered threats for 1,000 years. He drew breath to answer it. And one of the 2 figures who had come in with her, a tall man, older, who had stood this whole time a pace behind her chair with his hands clasped at his back, looked, not at the first, but up. He tipped his head back and looked up at the great glass dome over all our heads, into the wide column of daylight, into the bright sky beyond the glass. It is a small thing, a man looking up. But the veil were a body that read posture the way we read words, and they had spent 40 years convincing themselves that human stillness meant human emptiness. And so when the man looked up, 10,000 of them helplessly followed his eyes. They looked up at their own beautiful dome, the dome they had built to pour isolating light down onto the small and the judged. And they saw what was in the sky. I had not seen it come. None of us had. That was the point of it. While the reader had ground through the long list of settled matters, while the Concord had sat in its cold confidence reciting the weight of everything it had closed, the thing that humanity had become in 40 quiet years had been arranging itself, without sound, without announcement, in the bright daylight over the Concord's own capital, above the Concord's own glass roof, where the Concord, lit and warm and certain, would be the very last to look. I will not pretend I can describe it well from the floor. I saw it the way you see weather through a skylight, vast pale shapes hanging in the high blue, too large for the eye to take at once, arranged in a still and deliberate order across the whole width of the visible sky. Not crowded, not threatening, in any posture a veil could point to and call a threat. Simply present, simply enormous. Simply there, in numbers and in scale that no settled and stricken and concluded people could possibly have built, hanging in the sky of the world from whose register that people had been struck, on the very day that people had been declared closed forever. The seat had not been the answer. The seat was the question. The answer was overhead, and it had been overhead the whole time, and the Concord had been too busy sealing us to look up. The hall did not panic the way you might imagine panic. There was no screaming. The veil did not scream. Even then, even there, they kept that. What there was instead was worse, and quieter, and I will carry the memory of it to the end of my days. 10,000 gray faces tipped up at a glass roof in a single helpless motion, 10,000 throats rippling, and a sound rising out of all of them at once that was not a shout but a kind of low collective moan. The sound a great body makes when it understands, all at once, that the floor it has stood on for 1,000 years was never a floor. The first did not look up. I marked that too. He was the only one who did not look up, and I think it was because he already knew. He had felt it the moment the cord broke between her fingers. He sat in his high seat with all his countless edges, the master of finality, and he looked down at the small woman in the unbound seat, and his throat moved, and what came out of it was not law. "How long?" he said. She understood the question. So did I. He was not asking how long the ships had been in the sky. He He was asking how long humanity had been moving, quietly, beneath the seal, in the 40 years the Concord had spent believing the matter closed. How long the thing they had struck from the register had been building, unwatched, while they admired the finality of their own ruling. The woman in the seat did not gloat. I want that on the record because it would have been easy to gloat, and a lesser people would have, and the veil would have understood gloating. Gloating is a thing the powerful do, and the veil knew the powerful. She did not gloat. She answered him plainly, the way you answer a hard question from an old man who has just understood his whole life was a mistake. "Since the day you bound the chair," she said. And then she did the thing that I think the veil never recovered from. She did not press the advantage. She did not name a demand or a price or a sentence. She had every right to. The sky was full of her right to. Instead, she rose from the unbound seat unhurried, the way she had walked in, and she crossed at last to the speaking floor. And for the first time she stepped into the column of light, the bright pool built to isolate and shame. And she stood in it the way a thing stands in the sun, without flinching. And she looked up the rings at the body that had concluded her people. "You may keep your register," she said, 6 tears worth of throats stilled to hear it. "You may keep your seal and your ceremony and your list of settled matters. We did not come to be added to it." She paused, and the pause was not for effect. It was the pause of someone choosing the last words carefully because the last words are the ones that get written down. "We came so that you would know," she said, "that there is one matter you do not close. You may rule that we are finished as often as you like. We will go on being unfinished. That is the whole of it. That is all we came to say." And she stepped back out of the light. There was no more. That was the thing they could not hold against us afterward in all the long, bitter reckoning that came. There was no more. We did not fire on their world. We did not seize their hall. We did not strike a single one of them from a single roll. The ships hung in the daylight and did nothing, because doing nothing was the entire argument. A settled people cannot put a fleet in your sky, and ours was in their sky. And so we were not settled, and so the seal was a lie. And so the Concord's one unbreakable thing was broken, and all of it had been accomplished without our raising a hand or, very nearly, our voice. The 3 of them turned and walked back up the long aisle, through the rings of gray rippling throats, toward the open doors and the bright day, and they did not hurry going out any more than they had hurried coming in. The doors stood open behind them. The keepers did not move to close them. I am not certain the keepers were capable in that hour of moving at all. I stayed at my low table a while longer. I was, after all, the recording secretary, and the matter was not yet entered. I watched the Concord try to reconvene itself. I watched the first sit motionless in his high seat while beneath him the tears churned and stilled and churned again, members turning to members, the long, slow machinery of the body trying to find the procedure for a thing that had no procedure. There is no ruling for the sky being full. There is no seal you can press on a fleet. They had spent 1,000 years perfecting the art of declaring things over, and they had met, at last, the one people in the galaxy who declined to be over. And they had nothing, nothing in all their countless edges and all their weighted robes and all their grinding finality, with which to answer it. After a long time the first's throat moved one last time, and the hall went silent, and I readied my stylus to record whatever ruling the master of finality would make of the day his finality ended. He did not make a ruling. He said only, in their tongue, very quietly, a thing I have thought about every day since. Strike nothing further today. That was the order, not a sealing, not a closing, the opposite of every order that Hall had ever heard. Strike nothing further, close nothing else. For the first time in the history of the Vale Concord of settled matters, the body that existed to end things ended a session by ordering that nothing be ended. I wrote it down. Of course I wrote it down. I am a clerk. It is what I do. It is what I had done for 41 years in a book no one read. I wrote the order and the date and the broken seal and the unbound chair and the 6 flat words from the dark and the long pale shapes in the bright sky and the thing the woman said in the column of light about the one matter they do not close. I wrote it all in my plain hand, and when I was done I sat for a moment with the open book on the low table and looked up, the way the whole hall had looked up, at the great glass dome. The ships were still there. The daylight came down through them and through the glass and pooled, as it always had, on the empty speaking floor, except that now there was no one standing in it to be isolated and lit and shamed, and the bright indifferent column fell on nothing at all, and for the first time in 40 years it did not look like a thing built to make us small. It looked like a window someone had finally remembered to look out of. I closed my book. I have it still. I am an old man, and the channels that should not have worked still work, and the seat at the lowest ring is no longer bound. They never rebound it. I do not think any keeper among them could be made to touch it now, and the human matter sits in the veil register where it has always sat, marked in their slow grinding hand, as settled and sealed and concluded forever. They never struck the marking. They never could bring themselves to. I think they leave it there the way a man leaves a scar he was once proud of, after the day he learned what it had cost him, not as a boast any longer, but as a reminder. The Concord's whole dignity had been the finality of its rulings, and across the long face of its register, in its own permanent hand, stands the one ruling that everyone who reads it now understands to be a lie, the ruling that called us finished. We were not finished. We had only been quiet. They had mistaken the one for the other, the way the certain always do, and they had built a beautiful hall and a bright cruel dome and 1,000 years of finality on the mistake. And on a single afternoon a small woman with empty hands had walked in, unbound a chair, said that we were not here to petition, and let them look up at the sky. I wrote, on the last line of that day's entry, the only thing I have ever written in that book that was not a plain record of fact. I wrote it because someone, someday, would read the human ledger even if the veil never did, and I wanted it set down in a hand that had watched the whole 40 years. I wrote they sealed us, we kept building. The seal was never the end of us, it was only the day they stopped watching. And then I closed the book, and I left the sealing hall by the doors that no longer would close, and I walked out into the bright, unsettled day.